We have a morning must-watch today, and for it we turn to Las Vegas and that dramatic debate between the two principal candidates for president. Most of the headlines this morning are about the pyrotechnics, but in truth, there was a fair amount of substance addressed by both Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump. For example, Mr. Trump had an extended discussion with the moderator, Chris Wallace of Fox News, about his plan for economic growth. Here's part of it.
Even conservative economists who have looked at your plan say that the numbers don't add up, that your idea, and you've talked about 25 million jobs created, 4%
over a 10-year period
growth, is unrealistic. And they say, you talk a lot about growing the energy industry.
So I just left some high representatives of India. They're growing at 8%. China is growing at 7%, and that for them is a catastrophically low number. We are growing. Our last report came out, and it's right around the 1% level, and I think it's going down.
So joining us now is Mike McKee. He is our politics and economics editor, of course, joining us almost every day, which I'm happy to say. So, Mike, as I say, there was a fair amount of substance here that was addressed by both of these candidates. Take us into it. What real difference would it make for the U.S. economy if Donald Trump were president versus Hillary Clinton?
Well, there'd be a huge difference, according to the people who have analyzed these things, folks from Wharton, with the most recent study out, suggesting that Trump's plan would create jobs and boost the economy in the short run because it's extraordinary deficit spending with the big tax cuts. Over the longer run, it would cost jobs and the economy would be smaller than it otherwise would if his plan was not adopted. The opposite happens with Hillary Clinton. In the shorter run, because she raises taxes and cuts more spending, you're going to have a slower pace of growth, fewer jobs created. Over the longer run, and they're talking 2020 and beyond, you have more jobs created and greater growth. About a 4/10 swing. Trump's plan by 2020 would cost about 4/10 of GDP, while the Clinton plan would raise GDP above its baseline by 4/10.
Now, there's some range with the experts in how they evaluate this, because other people will say about Mr. Trump's plan, it doesn't cost as much as you just said, and in fact, we're underestimating the amount of growth that would actually be given us, including because of his trade, his restrictions on trade.
Well, a couple points there. One, it's very hard to evaluate the Trump plan because it's detail-free, especially his tax plans. He doesn't clarify a lot of what he's going to do, so people are making assumptions about what the plans would be. And 10 years out, no economist is going to be able to tell you what's actually going to happen because so much depends on the meantime. But there are a lot of misconceptions in Trump's plan about trade as well. First, that it's a zero-sum game and that we are worse off because we import more than we export. And also, for example, China. He rails against the Chinese, but Chinese imports are actually going down, not going up. 40% of the content of Mexican imports into the United States through NAFTA is products made in the U.S., sent there and reassembled into things. So there are a lot of analysis of his plans that try to take those things into account that his plan doesn't.
When you take into account what he said there in the debate, comparing U.S. to India and to China, those are emerging markets. They're supposed to be growing at 8, 9, 6, 7%. Talk about the distinction between that and the growth that we see here, which that last reads 2.5%.
There is no question that the U.S. is growing more slowly than it has historically, and it's growing more slowly out of a recession. This is a different kind of recession, and if you look at Rogoff and Reinhardt's work, they predicted this, that because it's a financial recession, you're going to have slower growth. But you can't compare the percentage gains, as you say, for emerging markets. And it's the fallacy of using percentages because they're coming from such a low base that growth is, on a percentage-wise, going to be faster than in the U.S. The U.S., we hope, can get back to growing more quickly, but it doesn't compare with what's going on in China.
Mike, another sharp difference between Mr. Trump and Ms. Clinton are the extent to which they would cut back on regulation. And one of the things that Mr. Trump says is if we cut back on regulation, we will get growth out of that. Hillary Clinton gives no indication she's interested in that. And as we talk to members of the business community, this seems to be pretty important to them, in their view.
It's always important to them. If you look at the surveys going back 20, 30, 40, 50 years, they always cite regulation as a headwind. Now, the Obama administration has increased regulation, and so there is a cost to business, but it's very hard to quantify. And part of the problem with the Trump plan is that he doesn't say what regulations he would cut. He just says, I'm going to cut regulations. So what does that actually mean for the economy? How do you measure it? You can pull a number out of the air, but unless you tell us exactly how you're going to change things. And another thing to keep in mind, when you talk about cutting regulation, you got to balance the other side. Suppose you take a steel plant and say, we're going to cut your regulation. You don't have to install scrubbers scrubbers. Okay, that saves the steel plant $1 million, but what about the guy who makes the scrubbers? That's $1 million business he's lost. So it's very hard to balance all those things out in the economic models.